She mopped their floors for 15 years. Then she walked into the boardroom and fired the CEO. They called her Miss Valerie, not Valerie Monroe, not Valerie from operations, and not Mrs. Monroe like she preferred. Just Miss Valerie, the janitor. Every morning at 5:45, long before the office lights clicked on and the logistics team started bragging about who closed what, she was already there, pushing a squeaky cart past the frosted glass doors of Hartwell Monroe Logistics. Her gray uniform had faded over the years, and her sneakers had flattened out from walking the length of that building so many times. She kept a rag tucked in her pocket, a quiet look on her face, and a rhythm in her step, as if she'd been doing this forever, and in a way she had. 15 years. 15 years of collecting crumpled napkins from conference rooms, picking up gum wrappers from the break room floor, and wiping fingerprints off the elevator buttons that no one ever seemed to clean. To most of the folks who worked there, she blended into the background like wallpaper. If she was in the room, they talked around her, through her, like she was invisible, except for a few decent ones, mostly interns or temps who hadn't learned yet that pretending not to see her was part of the job culture. But Valerie wasn't bitter, at least not at first. She kept her head down, kept her mouth shut, and listened. She listened to the laughter from corner offices, to the conversations that people thought weren't worth whispering. The jokes, the arrogance, the lies. She learned everything she needed just from a mop and a good pair of ears. One time, a marketing rep left a full sandwich on the trash can instead of inside it. Valerie picked it up and tossed it without a word. He walked by, didn't even say thank you, just looked at her and said, "Make sure the carpet's dry before the 3 o'clock meeting." She smiled and nodded. The next day, he spilled coffee on that same carpet and blamed her for not cleaning it well enough. She nodded again. It wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Down on the 4th floor, one of the senior VPs, Mason Hartwell, loud and always reeking of cologne, once laughed with his assistant, saying, "Can you imagine working here all your life and not even having a desk?" She heard him. He didn't care. He didn't know who she was. None of them did. That building was full of people who thought their titles gave them value, who thought respect had to be earned with quarterly goals and 10 a.m. meetings that should have been emails. They didn't know that Valerie didn't need their validation because Valerie owned more of that company than anyone in that building. But she hadn't told a soul, not yet. As she pushed her cart past the executive offices that morning, pausing to wipe down a glass wall where someone's fingerprints smudged the company logo, her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. One message, just a single sentence. "We're ready when you are." She put the phone back in her pocket, her expression unreadable, and then kept walking. But this time she wasn't just cleaning floors. She was walking towards something, and nobody saw it coming. Before Valerie ever held a mop in that building, she sat at a kitchen table in Oak Ridge, Georgia, poring over business plans with her husband, Darius Monroe. That was back when Hartwell Monroe Logistics wasn't even a name yet, just an idea scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt. Darius had the kind of raw ambition you couldn't teach. He'd grown up working his uncle's delivery trucks, running roads through Alabama and South Carolina. He knew logistics inside and out before it was ever called a supply chain. Valerie, on the other hand, was the brains behind the scenes. She didn't talk much in public, but she had a sharp way of looking at problems, quietly breaking things down and finding what didn't fit. In 1998, Darius and a friend named Mason Hartwell scraped together enough to start a freight brokerage, with just one rented office space, 2 flip phones, and a fax machine that barely worked. Valerie was the first to invest. Her father had left her a small inheritance when he passed, a life insurance payout most folks would have used for a down payment on a house. But Valerie had a different idea. "Put it in your name," she told Darius one night. "I'll stay in the background. Nobody needs to know." He looked at her across the table and said, "You sure? I know what I'm doing," she said. "And I trust you." Over the next 6 years, the company exploded. Mason handled networking, Darius took care of operations, and Valerie watched every dollar. She did the books, filed paperwork, and helped write contracts under a different LLC she registered just in case. It was her way of protecting them both. But Darius didn't protect himself. In 2004, a wreck on I-85 took him too soon. A late-night delivery run, a tired driver, a flipped trailer, gone in seconds. Mason gave a weak speech at the funeral. All business, barely mentioned Valerie. That was the first sign. The second came weeks later when Mason filed documents removing Darius's name and quietly pushed Valerie out of all internal communications. He assumed she'd disappear, but Valerie had receipts. Legal ones, signed documents from the very beginning that gave her equal ownership of Darius's share. And more than that, she had leverage. She could have sued, could have walked into that office with lawyers and demanded control right then and there, but instead she waited because Valerie knew the difference between power and timing. She said nothing. No press, no letters, just silence. Then, in 2007, a job opening showed up on a community board in Stanton, Virginia for night janitorial staff at Hartwell Monroe Logistics. She circled it. 2 days later, she walked in with a fake resume, a borrowed address, and a fresh pair of work shoes. She got the job on the spot. Mason never recognized her, not once. By that time, he wasn't even the one running the place anymore. A new name was floating around. Gavin Stockridge, a young MBA from Florida State who didn't know a thing about how the company was built, but knew how to dress like a CEO. Valerie kept her head down, kept showing up one night at a time, one floor at a time. 15 years. Every trash can she emptied. Every bathroom she scrubbed. It wasn't just cleaning. It was surveillance. She listened, watched, waited, and kept every single receipt. But eventually, what you bury comes to the surface, and Valerie was almost done digging. By year 10, Valerie knew every square inch of Hartwell Monroe's headquarters in the Stanton Business District. She knew which hallway had the loose floorboard, which microwave sparked when you closed it too hard, and which of the directors routinely used company cards for personal dinners. She didn't need to guess anymore. She knew exactly what was happening. Hartwell Monroe had gone from a tight-knit logistics company to a cold, bloated operation where upper management sat behind glass walls, throwing out jargon while frontline workers were barely hanging on. She'd watched warehouse drivers come in with backs aching, carrying overtime slips that never seemed to get approved. She'd hear the HR ladies whisper about cutting corners on health benefits, and more than once she saw mid-level managers getting escorted out, fired without notice because they'd violated protocol. One of them, a man named Terrence Doyle, made the mistake of speaking up in a staff meeting about salary disparities. He was gone within a week. Valerie was invisible in those rooms. No one filtered what they said around her. First, she just listened. But then she started writing things down. She kept a little black notebook inside her locker, tucked behind a plastic bag of backup gloves. It was filled with names, dates, quotes, who said what, when they said it, and who was in the room. If you flipped through the pages, you'd find entries like, February 14th, we can cut the bonus pool for lower staff. They'll take what we give them. Gavin to CFO, room 508. June 3rd, warehouse safety violation ignored. Man slipped, no paperwork filed. Delilah saw it. August 19th, heard Gavin say, let the janitor clean it up. That's what she's paid for. I was standing right there. It wasn't bitterness fueling her. It was clarity. She saw a company drowning in arrogance. One night around 11:45, Valerie paused her cart outside the 6th floor executive suite. The hallway was dark except for the light coming from the main conference room. She heard laughter inside. Gavin's voice carried. So I told him if he doesn't like his pay, he can clock out and try his luck driving DoorDash. I've got 20 more resumes waiting. Laughter followed. Then Delilah Voss added, half these folks should be grateful we even let them in the building. They all laughed again. Valerie stood there unseen. After a moment, she walked away. Not with anger, but with confirmation. The more she saw, the more she understood. This place wasn't just broken. It was rotten. And they weren't going to change just because someone asked nicely. They needed to be replaced. She started planning quietly, piece by piece. She met with her attorney in the back room of a diner off US Highway 17. A man named Tobias Crane, discreet and direct. She handed him a flash drive. Inside were years of notes, photos, recorded conversations. Everything she documented since day one. Tobias didn't say a word for a long time after going through it. Then he looked at her and said, you know, once you do this, it's going to shake that whole building. Valerie nodded. It's already shaking. They just don't know it yet. He smiled. I'll start drafting paperwork. The plan was simple. Let them walk straight into their own trap. Let them keep thinking she was just a cleaning lady. Let them underestimate her one more time. She wanted them confident, comfortable, because the fall always hits harder when you never saw the ledge. But sometimes even the most patient fire needs just one spark, and that spark was about to happen. On a regular Tuesday afternoon, it started with a paper plate. Valerie had just finished cleaning the third-floor break room, wiping down the counters, taking out the trash, and refilling the cheap powdered creamer they called premium. She was walking past the long conference hallway when she saw it. A half-eaten slice of birthday cake sitting dead in the center of the hallway floor, a fork sticking out of it, chocolate smeared on the carpet. Someone had just left it there. Not even on a table, just dropped it. She bent down slowly. Not because it was difficult, but because something about that plate felt deliberate, like someone did it just to see what she'd do. As she picked it up, she heard the voice. You missed the spot. It was Gavin, standing at the end of the hallway, hands in his pockets, smirking like a man with nothing to fear. She turned her head just slightly. Excuse me? He walked toward her slowly. Right there, he said, pointing to the floor next to where she just cleaned. We're about to have a client presentation in here. Think you can give the floor another pass before they come in? There was no spot, not even a scuff. Valerie stood up, cake plate in one hand, mop handle in the other. She didn't say anything. Gavin stared at her, then chuckled like she was part of some inside joke. I swear, sometimes I think you people just pretend to clean so you can stay on the clock. Her eyes narrowed just for a second. What people is that? She asked. He paused. Oh, come on, he said, laughing. Don't be so sensitive. I'm just saying if I paid you a little more, maybe you'd find the spots before I did. She blinked once, no expression. Then she nodded. I'll make sure it's spotless, she said. Gavin clapped his hands once. That's what I like to hear. He walked off, proud of himself, thinking he'd put her in her place. He had no idea. That night, Valerie didn't go straight home. She went to the Monroe records room, an area she had quiet access to after hours thanks to a badge she borrowed from a manager who'd once left it on a sink. She'd kept it for months just in case. She moved quickly, pulling files, taking photos, emails, budget reports, and most importantly, she printed a bonus report from that same quarter. It showed Gavin had given himself a $55,000 performance bonus for operational excellence. Meanwhile, he'd cut employee meal stipends, reduced driver overtime rates, and froze raises for custodial and warehouse staff. The final straw came the next morning. One of the janitors, Cynthia, came into the locker room crying. Her teenage son had been in a car accident, and she'd asked for a day off to visit the hospital. Her request was denied, not enough coverage, they said. Valerie sat there listening. Cynthia couldn't even finish a sentence through the tears. No one from the executive office cared. She was just a name on the schedule. Valerie didn't say anything, but she stood up, pulled her phone from her bag, and stepped outside. Over the next 48 hours, Valerie set the wheels in motion. She gave her lawyer the final receipts, made arrangements for a closed-door shareholder meeting, and scheduled an emergency review under her legal rights as majority holder. The funny thing was, none of them noticed. Not even when she came in the next day wearing a new coat, a pressed blouse, and shoes that hadn't touched a mop in months. She walked past the front desk, didn't even glance at her old cart. She took the elevator to the 8th floor, straight to the boardroom. But what she had to say wouldn't just change her life. It would shatter everything they thought they knew about power. The boardroom at Monroe Logistics had 12 leather chairs, one ridiculous chandelier, and a $14,000 custom table flown in from Seattle. Gavin once bragged about it being real walnut, like that was supposed to mean something to the janitors who cleaned gum from under it. At 10 a.m. sharp, the quarterly review began. Gavin stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, tie loose, like he owned the oxygen in the room. To his left sat Delilah Voss, his second in command. Next to her sat Mason Hartwell, the only man in the room who should have known what was coming, except he didn't. Valerie walked in 5 minutes later, silent as a held breath. No mop, no gloves. Just a navy blue blazer and a folder in her hand. Gavin frowned. I'm sorry, we're in a meeting. Maintenance is supposed to come through after hours. She didn't blink. I'm not here for maintenance. The room shifted. Delilah squinted at her. I'm sorry. Do you have an appointment? I do, Valerie said, walking slowly to the far end of the table. And I believe the shareholders were properly notified. That's when Tobias walked in behind her, briefcase in hand, calm as ever. Good morning, he said. My name is Tobias Crane, legal counsel for Mrs. Valerie Monroe, majority shareholder of Hartwell Monroe Logistics. Silence. Gavin's mouth opened, but no words came out. Valerie laid the folder down on the table and flipped it open. Inside were signed partnership agreements from 1998, updated ownership documents, and a notarized letter transferring full voting rights to her upon Darius Monroe's death. Mason shifted in his seat, like someone had pulled the rug out from under his feet. No, he muttered. That can't be right. Valerie turned to him. You remember the contracts, Mason. You helped write them. He didn't speak. She stepped forward, her voice calm and low. For 15 years, I watched this place become unrecognizable. Watched you pad your bonuses, ignore safety violations, and punish employees for asking for basic decency. She looked straight at Gavin. And I watched you turn my husband's company into a playground for your ego. Gavin tried to laugh it off. This is okay. This is a misunderstanding. I don't know what kind of scam this is. It's not a scam, Tobias interrupted. All documents have been verified, and as of this moment, Mrs. Monroe has called for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO. She has the authority to do so under the original shareholder agreement. Gavin stood up, both hands on the table. You don't know what you're doing. Valerie walked around the table slowly, looking each person in the eye. 15 years, she said. You all looked past me like I wasn't even there. You let people suffer. You let this company rot. I gave you every chance to show some humanity. She paused at Gavin's chair. And you failed. He turned red. You think you can just walk in here and take over? She leaned in. I am the company. Tobias placed a small stack of letters in front of each board member. Effective immediately, Mr. Gavin Stockridge's contract is terminated. Security has been notified. Gavin's voice cracked. You can't do this. Mason muttered under his breath. She already did. Security entered seconds later. They didn't say a word, just waited. Gavin looked around the room for backup. He found none. He grabbed his phone, his pride, and stormed out, followed closely by Delilah, who suddenly remembered she had another meeting. Once the room cleared, Valerie turned back to the board. I'm not here to play boss, she said. I'm here to rebuild what this place used to stand for. One of the younger board members, Jonas Emery, barely 30, raised his hand. What exactly do you want to do first? Valerie smiled. Start by listening to the people who've been ignored the longest. She closed the folder. Change starts today. But just because you take out the garbage doesn't mean the house is clean, and Valerie knew the real work was only beginning. The following Monday morning, Valerie parked in the executive lot for the first time. She didn't like it. Not because the space was bigger or closer or covered from the rain, but something about that lot felt disconnected, like it had been reserved for people who didn't know what it meant to sweat. Still, she parked, walked in, head held high. She greeted the front desk receptionist by name. Good morning, Tasha. The young woman blinked. Miss Valerie? It's just Valerie now. She stepped into the elevator. No mop, no cleaning cart, just a notepad and a full calendar. By 9:30 a.m., she was in her office. New paint on the walls, same window view Gavin used to brag about. But she didn't spend much time looking out. There was too much to do inside. First thing she did, called a staff meeting, not for the board, not for the executives, for the employees, drivers, admin staff, janitors, customer service reps, all invited. The room filled up quickly. People looked confused, some suspicious. No one knew what to expect. Valerie walked in, stood at the front. No microphone, just her voice. "I want to start by saying thank you," she began. "Most of you never knew who I was, and you didn't need to because your work spoke louder than any title in this building." She paused. "I'm here to change things, but not by myself. I've spent years listening to your frustrations, your fears, your ideas, quietly. Now, I want to hear them out loud." People started shifting in their chairs. It wasn't what they expected. A driver named Alonzo raised his hand. "Does this mean we get overtime back?" "Yes," Valerie said. "And retro pay for the last 2 quarters. You'll see it on Friday's check." A woman from HR, Deborah, stood up. "And the health coverage? It's been getting worse every year." "We're already reviewing new providers," Valerie said. "And every employee will get a survey to weigh in. No more backroom decisions about your well-being." There were no applause breaks, no over-the-top reactions. Just silence and then murmurs, people turning to each other like they were slowly realizing she was serious. Someone asked, "What about the people Gavin let go without cause?" "We're reviewing those terminations," she answered. "If you were wrongfully dismissed, you'll be contacted. No guarantees, but you'll get your name cleared at the very least." Another voice from the back. "You're really the owner?" Valerie smiled. "Always have been." She ended the meeting with a single promise. "If you speak, I will listen, and if you work, you'll be respected." After that, things didn't get easier. They got harder. The remaining executives didn't exactly welcome her with open arms. A few tried to block her decisions, arguing she didn't have the business background. One even questioned if she knew how to scale growth. Valerie looked at him and said, "I scaled my grief into silence for 15 years. I think I can manage your spreadsheets." That shut him up. She brought in new department heads promoted from within, people who had been overlooked for years. She changed vendor contracts, renegotiated warehouse leases, and brought back the annual Employee Appreciation Day that had mysteriously fallen out of budget years ago. She visited every single department, sat with them, ate lunch in the break room, listened, and slowly, the building began to feel different. Not softer, just more real. One night, Cynthia, the janitor who'd cried over her son's accident, left a note in Valerie's office. It said, "I didn't think anybody like us could ever make it to a place like that. You proved me wrong." Valerie kept that note in her top drawer. But even after all the changes, one question kept coming up in whispers, and Valerie knew she'd have to answer it. Why did she wait so long? It was a question she heard over and over. "Why'd you wait, Valerie?" Some asked it with curiosity, others with doubt, a few with quiet resentment, like maybe she'd let it go too long. But Valerie never got defensive. She'd just sit back in her chair, lace her fingers, and say the same thing every time, because power only matters when you know how to use it. See, Valerie didn't wait out of fear. She waited because the company needed to show who they were without her influence. She needed to see it with her own eyes, needed the rot to rise to the surface. Because if she had stepped in too early, they would have said she overreacted. They would have gaslighted her, spun it like she was making noise about nothing. But 15 years of silence made her undeniable. She saw everything. She let it play out, and when the time came, she didn't argue. She just showed them the truth, and they folded under the weight of their own decisions. The janitor had become the witness and eventually the judge. One afternoon, she walked back into the same hallway where Gavin once pointed at the spot she missed. Same carpet, same light. Except now it was spotless, and no one dared talk down to her. An intern passed her in the hallway, slowed down, and said nervously, "Hi, Mrs. Monroe." She smiled. Just Valerie. That afternoon, she hosted a small gathering for the staff in the company courtyard. No speeches, no banners, just food trucks and folding chairs and people laughing again. Alonzo, the driver, clinked his soda can against hers. "To the quiet ones," he said. Valerie raised her can to the ones they never saw coming. The lesson, it wasn't just about her ownership. It was about how easily we judge people by their uniforms, how quick we are to talk over someone holding a mop, how fast we are to assume value is tied to job titles in corner offices. Valerie wasn't the exception. She was the reminder. People aren't invisible just because you stop looking at them, and sometimes the person sweeping the floor is the one who built the house. So if you work with someone you've never really talked to, maybe stop and say hello. You never know who's holding the keys to the whole building. If the story made you pause, even for a second, share it, because somewhere right now there's another Miss Valerie getting overlooked, getting talked down to, getting erased. And maybe, just maybe, she's watching. Let her know we see her.